So, what would we like to talk about? Well, today I'd like to do a little bit of an introduction about aggression, right? What we mean when we talk about aggression, what are the limits of our definition of aggression for the purposes of this class, right? Because again, aggression and aggressive behaviors is quite broad, right? So there are a lot of things that can fall into that big box, right? And so what we're going to do is try to make that box a little bit smaller so that we can think about those things, okay? A lot of the research, a lot of the studies, a lot of the things we're going to talk about in this class are going to come from non-human animals. What is a non-human animal? It's any animal except a human, right? So we're going to think about studies in other species. There are a number of reasons why studies in non-human animals are actually quite interesting for aggression and aggressive behaviors. One of those is they don't let you just like put people in a room and then like try to make them fight each other to the death. They stopped that a long time ago. You know, we started, but Mason, we've lost so much great information. I mean, can you imagine with the scientific approaches we have today, but yet sort of the entertainment options of ancient Rome, like what we could really learn about aggressive behavior? I mean, we're just missing out on a ton of information here. And it's really kind of saddening in some respects, right?
MMA.
Yeah, that's a good caveat right there. There's actually, speaking of MMA, there's some recent work with like MMA fighters and folks analyzing pre-fight photography. Like, so you know, when these guys are gonna fight, they'll have two pictures. They'll have like a picture and they'll kind of face each other and they'll, you know, whatever, right? What they have found is the contestant that is smiling more is actually the guy that's going to lose. And the reason for that is there's like this whole, and we could talk about this at some point, there's this whole sort of evolutionary history of smiling and why we smile, why other species smile or have some kind of smiling behavior. But it's sort of a way to signal like non-threatening, right? And so primates who have hierarchies, non-human primates, right? Everything about like monkeys and chimpanzees and things, they kind of have a similar sort of facial expression to a smile where they'll bare their teeth but not in a threatening way, and it's a way for them to indicate, it's kind of like a nervous smile, right? It's a way for them to indicate to other members of their species like, hey, I know you're bigger than I am, so I'm not going to bother to attack you because you'll beat me up badly, and so kind of make a little, don't hurt me, kind of face. And so these MMA fighters will do the same thing, and what they've found is that's actually really predictive. So the next time you're going to bet with your buddies on like who wins in MMA, I know, right? Aspen's like, I'm going to make some money now. You're going to bet, you know, just look at the picture and kind of see who's got the bigger smile, bet on the other guy.
Do they say that they also have the same response to the guy that overreacts? It's like jumping around.
Yeah, absolutely, right? Because, and we'll talk a little bit about, today we're going to talk a little bit about aggression, but what you might not really think about as aggression, right? So there's the vast majority of aggression research is focused on the final stage, right? That actual violent physical interaction of aggression, right? But there's a long period of time and a ton of behaviors that lead up to that point, right? And some of that is sort of like displaying behavior, right? And kind of building yourself up, because one thing that you don't really want to do in reality is fight someone, because there's some risks to that. We'll talk about those risks. And if you can frighten off someone else or indicate to them that you're more, more impressive than you really are, then you can actually end up not fighting as much and not running that risk, whether you actually have the goods to back up your displays or not. So, yeah, so there you go, right?
How much time did I take up?
Oh, that was a good question.
I'm kidding.
That was a good question. Yeah. See? Good stories. All right, so we'll talk about aggression a little bit, and then we'll talk about some genetic aspects. I am not going to anticipate for this class that you are going to remember specific gene names, right? Because they give them really stupid names. They give them these like 3 and 4 letters with a couple numbers, and then maybe like a special character, right? It's like an advanced password for your banking account. Is how they name genes. Sometimes they actually are related, like the name sounds like what it does, and then sometimes it doesn't, okay? But we do want to think about genetic aspects. We're going to think about hormones. We're going to think about environmental aspects, the developmental aspects over the course of this entire semester, okay? So it's going to be kind of interesting. All right. We should talk briefly about some basic concepts for genetics, right? I'm assuming most of you have had some sort of biology class over the course of your life, right? I think that's probably a reasonable thing to assume, right? But you may or may not have had a genetics class. It may have been a while, right? So we do want to think about just a little bit of what some of these words mean, right? So when you go through and you're reading some of this literature, either to prepare for the exam or to prepare for your project, your paper, it's kind of nice to have some idea about what's going on, right? So when we talk about alleles, what do we mean by an allele, right? It's just some version of a gene, right? For those of you that aren't, I guess we should step back, right? So humans have 23 chromosomes, right? We have two kinds of chromosomes, what are called autosomal and sex chromosomes. These are your X's and your Y's. These are all the others, okay? All species that reproduce sexually, which is pretty much every species we're going to think about, right? There are some weird ones that don't, but they don't really factor into what we're going to discuss. We'll have these two types of chromosomes, autosomal and sex. The autosomal number might vary from species to species, right? So chimpanzees, for example, they don't have 23 different chromosomes, they have like 22, right? So they've got the X and the Y, and then they've got 21 over here instead of the 22 that we have, right? And so there's kind of a difference. You get, just in case you want to know, half of your genes come from your genetic father, half come from your genetic mother. They mix around in some way to make that wonderfully unique person that you are, genetically speaking at least, right? So, that's the basics of chromosomes. The versions of the gene that you get, right? There's not an infinite number of gene variants, right? There's like a limited set, right? Some of them work better than others at their given job. Some of them work too well at their job and cause you to overproduce things, right? And that can be a problem. So, how many of you have heard of something like Huntington's disease? Yeah, that's fairly well known, right? If you get the one allele of that Huntington gene that has got some problems in it, you're going to develop Huntington's disease at some point in your life. That makes that what we call a dominant gene. You only need one copy of that to express that particular trait, right? If it's a recessive gene, you would need two copies, okay? You'd have to get the same copy from your mother and your father, right? Blue eyes kind of works this way, right? I don't know if you have blue eyes or you know someone who has blue eyes, right? Blue eyes is a recessive characteristic. Now this is, Jacob, a slightly simplified story about eye color, so just please be aware of that, right? I'm not going to tell you all the other nuances because there are a few. But blue eyes, for example, is a recessive trait. You would have to get the blue-eyed allele from each of your parents to have blue eyes, right? If you don't get the blue-eyed allele from both of your parents, you don't have blue eyes. That's how that works. You end up with brown eyes, right? Okay. So this is sort of how like two brown-eyed folks can actually have a blue-eyed baby, and it doesn't involve extramarital copulation, right? So that can happen as well. We'll talk about that when we need to. But let's say you have a brown-eyed gene and a blue-eyed gene, you're going to have brown eyes. Your partner has a brown eye gene and a blue eye gene. She has brown eyes or he has brown eyes as well. Your offspring could get those two blue-eyed genes, you know, just randomly, and then you end up with blue eyes. So it happens. Okay. Yeah.
Green-eyed, blue-eyed.
Just go home. No, so actually, with eye color, so green eyes for our purposes are going to be
recessive.
They're going to be blue eyes too. Yeah, it's all going to kind of fall the same. There are other, again, it's a little bit of a simplified story. There are some other genes involved, some other ways that this kind of works. But yeah, but green eyes or hazel eyes are going to be in that same blue eye category. Non-brown eye, I guess, is kind of what we're considering. And if you have one of each, that's kind of strange, right? So they're just that phenotype is expressed a little differently, which is kind of interesting. So there you go. All right, so dominant and recessive genes, we talked about that a bit. Chromosomes, alleles. We did not talk about Gregor Mendel, right? You guys familiar with Gregor Mendel? Man, the guy loved pea plants, right? So he's the person who sort of figured out how genetic inheritance works, right? Prior to Mendel, there were a ton of ideas that weren't right. After Mendel, there were a ton of ideas that weren't right. This guy was in Austria. He was a monk, just making pea plants, you know, growing peas. Interestingly, he sent a bunch of his papers to Darwin and said, hey, read these, they're awesome, because I wrote them. And for whatever reason, Darwin didn't bother to read them or didn't quite understand them, because when he did a lot of his work, he actually favored a different approach to genetic inheritance than what we call Mendelian inheritance, right? And so this just basically means you get one copy of each gene. If it's a dominant gene, that's what you express. It'll block out a recessive. To get a recessive trait, you have to have 2 copies, right? Because that's all you got. Questions about that? I don't really want you to get too deep into this, but just enough so when we go through and talk about some things, you guys are on the right page. Okay? Does that work? Also, Gregor Mendel wasn't his actual name. He changed his name when he joined the monkhood. I don't know. That's what it's called. But he was a mathematician, actually. Studied it. Actually, anybody familiar with the quadratic formula? Yeah, I know, right? It's having some flashbacks. Mendelian inheritance and the quadratic formula are sort of very similar, one and the same. So it's kind of a cool thing. All right. Questions, comments, concerns? Questioning who your parents are? It's like, oh, what color are my eyes? The thing that can't happen is 2 blue-eyed people can't have a brown-eyed baby. So that one you know, right? That one you can figure out something else happened. And usually you know where to point the finger if you understand how reproduction works. Yeah, Emily, it's making sense to you now, right? You're adding all this stuff up, huh? So there you go. Questions? No. All right. So here's a fun question. What is aggression? Right? So we want to think about what is aggression. And we are going to use this phrase called agonistic behavior. Why would we use a phrase like agonistic behavior? We already call it aggression. Well, a lot of times when it comes to studying a particular phenomena, what we want to do is we want to give it a label that's not the same label you use normally. Because when you go out and you talk about someone being aggressive or something looks aggressive or there's some sort of modified meaning to that word, right? If we try to use that word aggression in some research or something, we have to define that first. This is what we specifically mean by our narrow definition of aggression, right? So there were some folks back in the 60s really got interested in this, and they came up with this phrase, agonistic behavior, right? And so what do we mean by agonistic behavior? Again, it's some sort of behavior pattern. That behavior pattern has to have a function, right? That is an adaptation to a situation that involves, in this case, they're thinking about physical conflict between members of the same species. So that is a lot, right? And what does that mean? So there's some parts here that we should sort of pull out, right? One, for this purpose, or for the purpose of this definition, we're specifically thinking of behaviors, right? We're not necessarily thinking about internal thoughts or feelings or other sort of internal mechanisms, right? So we're not really considering that, right? That doesn't mean that part of the interaction or that part of the process is not important, is not involved, right? But just for the purposes of this definition, we're only looking at the behavior. Again, that behavior has to have some function, right? That has some sort of desired outcome. Now, you may or may not achieve that outcome, right? Okay, but this behavior, because it has a function, there is a desired outcome for that behavior, right? Most aggressive behaviors are going to be related to resource acquisition, right? Okay, some resource is, you either need that resource and someone else has it, or you have a resource and you have to defend that resource from other folks, right? Other members of your same species. Why is it important that we're thinking about the same species? Okay, because for for our purposes of this definition, we are not thinking about predatory behaviors. Okay? So a cat eating a mouse, we're not going to consider that aggression. Okay? Cats and mice, two different species, right? That's a predator-prey situation. There's a whole body of literature for that somewhere else. We're not going to necessarily consider that. We're also not going to think about, in this situation, reproductive termination, or at least these folks didn't. There's some argument that maybe that should be included, depending on how you think about this. What we mean by reproductive termination is infanticide, right? So often in many species, if a male takes over the territory of another male, females of that species will have sort of spontaneous abortions, right? So they will, I know, it's kind of interesting in some sense. They'll abort their offspring, or the male will often kill the existing offspring if they're, of a certain age, where they are still requiring attention from their mother. It's particularly true of mammals. That way, those females of sort of reproductive capacity are available for the male who's now in the territory, right? And this has some interesting implications, right? I mean, so Jake, you're thinking about this. It actually has some interesting implications for, we wanted to think about like humans, right? If we kind of wanted to think about this in terms of human behavior for like step families, right? There's actually a good bit of evidence that indicates that there's a higher percentage or proportion of like domestic violence cases, like child abuse cases in sort of stepchild situations than in biological child situations. So does not excuse the behavior by any means, right? But provides some different understanding of that behavior, right? And so my sort of thinking on this is, the more we can understand a behavior that doesn't in any way excuse that behavior, but that allows us to perhaps better plan and prevent that behavior from occurring if it's something we've decided that's not acceptable, right? So in this case, if we understand some of those like child abuse physical situations better, if we can look at animal models and we can think about this in those terms and look at those biological underpinnings, then perhaps that gives us some insight to help modify human behavior. I was going to use the word control. That sounded a little manipulative, but we'll go with modify, right? So we can modify human behavior. So anyway, same species, right? For these purposes, we're thinking about physical conflict. The reason is this definition is coming from animal research, right? So we might think of, in our society, non-physical conflict between humans, right? Because we have some sort of ways that you might try to define as a non-physical communication, right? How many of you have ever had an electronic conversation with someone, right? Yeah, I mean, you can send text messages, right? Tweets, those things can get pretty aggressive, right? You might not think about that as physical, but it is very physical, right? It's still a behavior. Because we've made some technological modifications to our interactions with others, you don't necessarily have to be in any kind of proximity to an individual, right, to exhibit sort of aggression toward them. You would have to be if you were a dog. Dogs, as far as I'm aware, don't have email. Although some of you may have set up an email address for your dog. Miriam, you look guilty of that. That's a very guilty face, I just want to say. Does your dog have a Facebook page? Maybe. So again, we're going to think about things that are in some physical proximity, okay? What behaviors will this include? There are what we call offensive behaviors, defensive behaviors, and parental aggression. Okay. So parental aggression is pretty simple. This is protecting your offspring, whether you're the mother or the father. We think that's that's something that I think we can all conceptualize, right? Some of you may be parents. You may have done something that was an aggressive behavior to protect your offspring. Some of you may think of your dogs, Miriam, as your offspring, and you may have done something aggressive to protect that dog. Some of your parents may have done, or committed some aggressive behaviors to protect you at some point, right? And that doesn't mean they've attacked someone or punched them in the face. That means they may have stepped between you and another person, right? If they thought there was a threat of some sort. They may have yelled at someone. They may have, as Mason was talking, jumped up and down a little bit, and tried to shake their fist at someone for some things. So that's parental aggression. We'll have a whole chapter we'll talk about maternal aggression and different things. There's also offensive and defensive behavior, right? So offensive behavior is when you're sort of initiating the attack, right? Defensive behavior is you obviously trying to fend off that attack, right? So there's two sides of the same coin there. What's really interesting is in most cases, offensive behavior is going to lead to fewer injuries than if you were to commit have defensive behavior, right? So being the attacker has some advantage, right? So if there wasn't, so if you think about this, let's say you're a species and being the attacker has no advantage. You would probably not develop over time, over evolutionary time, aggressive behaviors, right? Why would you? If there's no advantage to you attacking and being that attacker, there's no reason for you to be aggressive, right? You need to be good at defense, right? So you think about that. I think you can think about humans. We are an aggressive species, right? How many of you have ever committed an aggressive act? Everybody, right? Everybody's done it. Just be honest. So even if you don't remember, it might have been when you were 4 and you ripped a toy motorcycle out of some other kid's hand, right? You're acquiring resources. You thought that was an important resource. Okay. That's not from a personal example, by the way. So there is an advantage to having that offensive behavior. It's not me telling you to go out and start attacking people if you want their laptop. Okay, that's a bad idea. Right? What that's saying is you're less likely to be injured if you are the aggressor than if you are on the defense, right? And when that's the situation, you're going to develop aggressive behaviors, tendencies, hormones that lead to that, genes that lead to that, right? It's going to be exciting. All right. For offensive and defensive behavior, motor patterns are going to be different, right? Now in humans, we don't necessarily always like to think about motor patterns, right? We don't like to think about the sort of stereotypical behaviors, and I don't mean stereotypical, well, I kind of do still, those behaviors that are repeated, right? But we do think about this in animals. There are ways that you can trigger these motor patterns in animals, right? You can expose whatever species you want to pick that's your favorite to a particular stimulus, and that can trigger a sequence of behavior.
Who's Blanchard and Blanchard?
Blanchard and Blanchard are folks from chapter 1, and they also wrote a chapter later in the book, so that's their definition from the book. Sorry, there's my non-APA format. I didn't put a year for you. Yeah, these guys, they did a lot of work on aggression, defining aggression, and sort of animal studies of aggression. So they've done a ton of work. Their names will pop up as you're reading through the book and looking at other resources. It's a good question. There's 2 minutes you saved to your classmates. So again, these motor patterns differ, right? We like to think about humans as being very flexible with our behaviors. We are. We have a ton of behaviors that we can commit, that we can try to stop in the middle, but other species can do something similar as well. Okay, but we will look at those motor patterns. They are going to be different. You can think about that, right? If you're going to attack someone, let's imagine here in a couple weeks we're all going to imagine that we're crabs. So let's just think about like everybody get into your crab mindset. And if you're a crab and you're going to attack another crab, that's going to be different than if you are that defending crab, right? You're going to be committing different behaviors, different motor patterns, okay? They do serve different functions as well, right? Offense is about resource acquisition. Defense is about resource protection, right? Okay? And again, a defensive attack is going to be much more likely to cause a serious injury than an offensive attack. Okay. All right. So there you go. Always be on the edge, running around, ready to attack. Right? I always try to give you these good take-home messages.
Is defensive a serious injury expand that to like emotional injury as well? Instead of just like physical?
Yeah, I'm sure some folks have looked at that, and that's really interesting. And I think you're well on your way to an interesting project now, right? So there's your topic. You have to write about that. That's what you get for asking that good of a question. We'll let you save a minute as well. So I think, yes, I actually would speculate that that's accurate.
So now looking at that, I was thinking, is that where like a lot of like aggression issues come in humans? Like instead of like not just like talking about physical injury, but like that's why like whenever someone may like, I don't know, not trigger somebody the wrong way, instead of like thinking about it, they just automatically attack.
Yeah.
They're afraid of, you know.
I think so. I think however you want to define aggression, being on the offensive is going to be safer. Whether that's physically, emotionally, electronically, some tweets, whatever. I think being the attacker is going to be it. And I say better, not like you should actually just go attack people, but it's going to be less likely to carry risk, right? Because all aggressive behavior carries risk, right? There's some risk of injury to you, but there's some reward as well, right? There's some payoff to that aggressive behavior, right? What is that?
I'm sorry.
I'm sorry.
No, because like I just thought of like how like an example of that, like what I was thinking about was like self-sabotaging in a relationship, like when you've been like.
That's interesting. Yeah.
I mean, do you know where I'm coming from? Like if you've like been hurt a lot, so like the first time you have someone that does something that's like even maybe like a little too good, if you don't expect much from a person, but you get too much.
Yeah.
It's like something in you's like something's wrong. So like now you gotta like I don't know, start something or.
That's an interesting line of thought. I recommend you check that out. Write your paper. Start your career. Whatever you want to do with it. But I think you're right. I think you're onto something there. And I think this goes back to the idea that we shouldn't, and this is a point they try to make in the first chapter of the book, we should not just focus on that final stage of that sequence of aggressive behavior, right? The earlier we can start our investigations, our focus, the earlier we can start to, and better we can figure out what that pattern of behavior is, right? That gets us there. And if some of that is internal thoughts and feelings, then I think, at least in humans, we can study that. It's kind of hard to study rat feelings, right? So that's why we have, and this is one of the pitfalls of a lot of aggression literature, is that if it is focused on animals, one of the downsides, one of the great things is we can manipulate whatever we want. The downside is we have to make sure that animal does something that's clearly interpretable to us as aggressive, right? And to do that, it's typically got to be a physical fight, a physical interaction, right? If you're studying humans, though, as you've noted, you can think about other sort of aggressive acts, right? Other things that are aggressive. You can go back to, those thoughts and feelings, and the sort of small things that you might do to set that up, right? To protect yourself by being the attacker, right? So there you go. You should all just go into all of your relationships now, because that's going to be safer for you, right? Why is no one writing this down? These are life lessons. Nobody. All right. But you got to balance that out, right? I mean, and I think that's the hard part, right? Is like, how do you as a species that no longer sort of exists in the environment in which it developed, how do you navigate life that way, right? Because we developed in an environment where there weren't really rules like written down that could get you in trouble, right? The most important rule was like who's bigger, right? And that kind of is right. That's who got the resources. Whoever was bigger and stronger, perhaps who had the bigger brain, was smarter to sort of develop some sort of cheat, right? Like a spear, whatever that is. But that's completely different than our situation now, right? We have to kind of like think about how we're going to navigate in a different sort of resource acquisition. Right? I don't know. So I think that's kind of interesting. So again, we're thinking about protection versus obtaining and retaining resources, right? And that's kind of the difference between offensive and defensive aggression. Good points. Questions? No, not too bad, right? All right, so let's think about the evolution of aggression, right? We've hinted at this just a little bit. Every trait that you have, at least in terms of our thinking, has to add some reproductive advantage, right, to you in order to get passed on through natural selection, right? If there's a trait that decreases your reproductive capacity or your likelihood to reproduce, guess what's going to happen to that? Nothing. It stopped with you. Why? You didn't have any offspring to give it to, okay? On average, right? That doesn't mean that it happens that way all the time, but just on average, right? People who can, or members of a species who can reproduce at a higher capacity will reproduce at a higher capacity, right? So let's go back and think about those crabs that we all are for just a few moments, right? And if you're a crab with a bigger claw, and that gives you some advantage to acquire mates, then guess what? The next generation of crabs is going to have bigger claws, right? But if you're, like, say, a super fast crab and you've got smaller claws, and instead of a big claw, you've been evolving down the fast crab lane, I know, right? You have to think about these things. Then your offspring are going to be faster than other crabs, right? So you constantly have these sort of competing forces. But the idea, again, is in order for something to make it through to the next generation of your species, to your offspring's offspring, it has to give you some reproductive advantage over other members of your species, right? You have to be able to get that genetic material to the next round. If it doesn't make it to the next round, then that next round can't benefit from whatever that is. It must not have been that beneficial, right? Okay. Now there's like a whole set of things we could talk about, where we could talk about, you know, like random mutations and genetic drift and things like that, Emily, but we're going to ignore that for now. Does that work? Okay. Again, aggressive behavior definitely has advantages, but it also has consequences, right? Let's say you're not very good at aggressive behavior. Guess what happens? You don't get resources. You end up dying. Okay? And that has happened over the course of the history of our species, so we're pretty good at being aggressive, right? Is that going to change anytime soon? Probably not. All right, so we got our advantages. What are the advantages to being aggressive? More food, right? Better shelter, access to more mates, right? Those are the things for our purposes we're going to think about typically being those advantages. The consequences could be death, injury that incapacitates you in some way, injury that would prevent you from acquiring more resources, that would give you an abundance of energy to reproduce, and it could just drastically drop your reproductive potential directly. Okay, so those are some potential consequences. Now, we can talk specifics, right? What's an advantage if you're a crab to being aggressive? Well, you get a better crab hole, you know, so you can have a funner place to live, right? You can dig in, I don't know, put up a TV or whatever down underground in the sand. That's where crabs live, I guess. I don't know. You get more access to food sources. That's great. What are the consequences if you're a crab? Well, again, injury, right? What if you get in a fight with somebody and your claw is injured, right? And you've lost that great fighting claw. So then you're kind of done, right? You're just going to be, you know, a clawless crab shuttling around the rest of your life. Okay. You guys don't think about these things, do you? I can tell. Like, nobody thinks about crabs without claws.
Yeah, I do.
Yeah. Like while you're eating them?
Well, no, not without that, but yeah, I mean, I can now see the non-aggressive crabs going around and going,
All right. Probably one of the smartest things you can do is evaluate the likelihood of your success in an aggressive encounter, right? That's brilliant, right? And the better you are at evaluating that potential interaction, the more successful you're going to be, right? There are very few individuals of any species that are going to be successful in every interaction. right? There's always going to be somebody bigger. There's always going to be somebody faster. There's always going to be somebody that developed a spear when you didn't, right? That's always going to happen. But you need to evaluate and analyze that situation, right? And so how would you go about doing it? How would you go about sizing up someone, right? And that's kind of very much what we're doing, or what we're thinking about. So there are typically, for each species, this is going to vary, right, depending on what that species can do. There are going to be these stereotyped sequences of behaviors, and they're going to evaluate that potential aggression. One of these is vocalizations, right? So one of the more well-known examples are red deer, okay? Now, if you don't know what a red deer is, just imagine a deer that's sort of red, and I think you're there. What they will do is when two males come across each other, they're going to try to compete for resources because they're a herding animal. There's one male that's in charge of a herd of females, and that male that's in charge has access to those females for reproductive purposes, right? So that's kind of the arrangement that works for red deer. But another red deer is going to come over, so what are they going to do? Well, first they're going to yell at each other. Like 3,000 times a day, they're going to yell at each other, right? In their fun deer voices, like, I'm a bigger deer, leave me alone. So like literally 3,000 times a day, they'll just kind of bark at each other, right? If one of the deer is substantially louder than the other, right? More impressive with those vocalizations, the other deer may decide to leave, right? That deer may decide, whoa, listen to that guy's voice. I'm going to run away from him because I think I'm going to lose. Right? It's just not worth the effort, right? Why would you get into a fight you know you're going to lose? That doesn't seem like a good idea. Because you might get injured and you never get a fight again, right? So you're never going to get access to any resources. Okay? If they have their barking match, and after 3,000 of those vocalizations, they go, we're pretty even, let's see what's next. Right? So check mark, even on that. We got to go to the next step. These guys will often do what's called a lateral display. And this is fairly common, not just in red deer, but other species. And it's very much what it sounds like. They'll walk side by side, right? And they'll just kind of walk and look at each other and see, okay, who's bigger, who's the meaner looking deer, right? They'll kind of size each other, literally sizing each other up, right? If one of the deer is considerably larger than the other, the smaller deer at that point can go, you know what, it's not worth it, right? I'm going to back down, okay? I'm going to leave. I've not invested much into this, so I'm not going to lose much if I leave now, right? Okay, so I'm good. Yeah, my voice is a little hoarse because I yelled at you 3,000 times, but I'll be fine tomorrow and I go yell at a smaller deer and see what I can do there, okay? Once you get past the point of this particular stage with red deer, and everybody's equal, then they're actually going to fight, right? Because there's only one way to find out now, right? Well, we both yelled enough. Check mark there, that's an even. We both are the same size, we walked by each other, we figured out, hey, we're even there. So what's left? We actually have to play this thing out, right? We actually have to have a fight. And so that's what they'll do. They'll actually fight each other. Whoever wins, typically it's whoever lives, right? Often they'll fight to the death. And once you're dead, well, that was the last opportunity you had to reproduce. So great job on that. If you properly evaluated the situation, right, and you thought you had some advantage, then great, you probably won. If you improperly evaluated the situation, well, too bad, we're sorry. But this works in the other direction as well, right? Imagine you were the bigger deer. Imagine you were the louder deer. And you were not great at evaluating how well you could attack another deer, right? What's going to happen? Well, you're going to lose out on your opportunity to reproduce as well because you're not going to take those chances, right? You're going to think, well, that deer can beat me even though it's smaller, even though it's not as aggressive or its fighting capacity or fighting ability is not as good, right? And we have some fancy words to talk about what those are. Resource holding power, RHP. What is that? That is basically your fighting ability in this example, right? That's the ability of the deer to fight. What's its resource holding power? How great is it at hanging on to those resources that it has? How great is that deer at maintaining its leadership of the herd? Okay, resource holding power. What is the resource value, right? That's how important is the value of that resource, okay? So let's imagine you're a red deer, you're just walking around now, and you're looking for a herd of deer to take over, right? Because you've decided, well, I'm pretty awesome, it's time for me to mate with all of these other deer out there and make a bunch of half copies of me so they can go off and be awesome as well, right? And then your deer brain, that's exactly, you know, what you're thinking. So you go out into the world, you're looking for a deer, you come across a deer, and it has a herd size of 2, right? Let's say it has 2 members in that herd. It's a deer that you could probably beat if you wanted. You're gonna waste your time on 2 deer. Just on the other hillside, there's another deer that has 15 deer in its herd, right? Which has a higher resource value, 2 or 15. If you're looking at number of mating partners, 15 is bigger, right? So you're gonna be more likely to attack the deer that has 15. Now you got to do the rest of that calculation though. You got to look at the resource holding power of the deer, right? You don't really want to waste your time on 2 deer, but what if that's the only deer you can beat? What if that lead deer is the only one you can take down? Well, you're going to have to attack that, right? Because the equation works out. If you go over to the 15 deer and you're like, well, there's no way I'm going to take that guy out, then you'll pass on that. So it's a constant sort of evaluation process, right? You have to constantly be doing the math on this to figure out where do I need to commit my resources, where do I need to commit my efforts, because again, we want to avoid as many of these negative consequences as possible in an aggressive interaction, right? Okay? Makes sense, right? How many of you are here because you're trying to acquire resources? Yeah, everybody, right? Just raise your hands. There are really only 2 important things in life. Food and sex, right? And probably the food's not that important, right? So you're probably, the more food you have, probably the on some level, right? Because food is a resource, right? The more likely you are to have more offspring, right? And so that's kind of the drive there. So you think, well, why am I here? Why am I, you know, trying to get some education? I'm hoping it's because you guys all want jobs, right? Who wants a job when you're finished up with this? Right, there you go, right? What are you going to get with that job? You're going to get resources, right? Okay. How many of you, don't raise your hands on this one, okay? How many of you, at some point in your life before you got here, had the moment when you had to think about which career path am I going to pursue, right? Which set of educational paths, which one of those am I going to pick, right? I'm going to imagine you all had that moment, right? And what did you do? You looked at your resources, right? Your resource holding power, your ability to complete those paths, and you looked at the value of each of those resources, right? Now that might have been different for each individual person, but you had to make some decision there, right? You had to decide, I'm not very well suited for this particular path because of these 3 reasons. But this particular path, that's going to work for me, I'm going to be successful. However, the payoff's not what I want, right? So maybe the end result's not quite the benefit that you wanted, right? So you have to find a path that works for you, right? While we wouldn't consider that necessarily an aggressive interaction or an aggressive behavior, you can see the same sort of thought pattern, the same sort of behaviors, the same sort of evaluation is behind that, right? It's all about comparing the resource value and the consequences of acquiring that resource, right? And that's very much what we're thinking about here. And you could express this if you wanted, I'm not going to ask you to, mathematically. You could actually just write out a very simple mathematical equation, right? And you could figure out if that's something you should pursue or not. Yeah. So you can make all your decisions this way. You're doing it anyway. You just may not be doing it very effectively. Because you're probably letting emotions come into the picture rather than just like sheer numbers, right? So the next time you want to make a decision, go, well, what's the resource value scale of 1 to 10? Be objective. What's my ability to obtain that resource without any negative consequences, scale of 1 to 10, right? And then you can decide if that's what you should do or not. So there you go. I've just solved every problem for you the rest of your life. All right, questions about that? This is a sort of an important portion of this sentence, or a bullet point. While evaluation, go ahead.
Basically, the evolution and progression of sex
Yeah, that's sexual reproduction. I mean, you have to reproduce to pass on whatever genetics you have that might lead to aggressive behavior, right? So that is the sort of the key, right? You can be really aggressive, but if you don't reproduce, then that trait's not going to go through to the next generation. Which, actually, is sort of an interesting point. Can you be too aggressive? Well, absolutely, right? And that's why we have sort of the baseline aggression that any species has, because that amount of aggression is what's been successful in the past at acquiring resources and mates and reproducing, right? The less aggressive members of that species were not great at reproducing. The more aggressive members of that species were not necessarily great at reproducing either, or that species would be more aggressive or less aggressive, right? Does that make sense? And it varies from species to species, right? Like, it'd be difficult, but I guess you could come up with an actual, like, what's the magnitude of aggression, right? Solitary species are probably a bit more aggressive than social species, right? Humans being a social species, we have to kind of temper our aggressive behaviors with some cooperative behaviors as well, right? So that we can actually succeed as a species. We do not have those awesome things like big claws and teeth and shells or laser eyes, right? Whatever you think might be helpful.
So I was always a little confused about this. So can literal aggression just be passed down in a trait, or is it like actual aggression, or is it just like traits that could possibly lead to aggressive behavior later on?
I think that's probably the better way to think about it. So what will happen is, and we'll talk more about this as we go through, right? There are genes that are associated with aggressive behavior, right? What does a gene do? Well, it creates something, right? All of your genes create something. And what is that something? Well, typically it's a protein. It could be some sort of molecule that's going to float around. We'll talk about brain molecules at some point that make you aggressive or not aggressive, right? Serotonin, for example, it's a pretty obvious one. How many of you are familiar with selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, SSRIs, right? One of the reasons they will give someone an SSRI is to treat irritability and aggressive behaviors, right? So what this does is this increases your level of serotonin, okay? The more serotonin you have, the less aggressive you are, okay? There are folks who have higher or lower natural abilities to create serotonin. They have more or fewer receptors than average, right? Individuals that create more serotonin, that have more serotonin receptors, less likely to be aggressive, right? Those individuals that again, and genes control the creation of those receptors and of serotonin. So if you pass on genes that indicate that you're going to produce less serotonin, you're more likely to be aggressive yourself, and your offspring are more likely to be aggressive, right? Because they're going to have less serotonin. It's going to lead to aggressive behaviors. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I was just always confused because the way I've been told about it a lot, it people kind of make it seem like the baby's just going to automatically come out as aggressive as you. That's the way I've been told. That's how it's been read.
Yeah.
And I've been taught that aggression is learned behavior.
Well, they're man, you're just really trying to save time. I mean, you guys are teaming up here. I mean, that's like 8 minutes between the two of you. So, can aggression be learned? Absolutely, right? And I think any behavior that is central to survival is going to be very complex, right? It's going to have a lot of opportunities to modify that behavior, right? A lot of opportunities to cause that behavior to happen even if one particular system fails, okay? And I like to think about this like food, for example, right? Eating. Why do you get hungry? Well, there are 10 different things that happen to make you hungry. And sometimes one of those doesn't work. 5 of those may not work. You're still going to get hungry, right? Why? Eating is very important for survival. I just want to toss that out there. I know some of you didn't realize that, but eating is important for, you can write that down. It'll be on the exam, right? And so we have a lot of different systems to make sure that you actually eat. Okay? Aggression is important too, so we're going to have several systems to make sure that happens, right? We're going to have these genetic systems. We're going to have hormones that are created that can drive these behaviors. But we would also need to be able to learn when to apply or not apply aggressive behaviors, right? And that way you can have some more nuanced control over that behavior. And so I don't like to think of aggression as just learned or just an automatic thing, right? There are times where things might fall into either of those categories, very narrow, specific aggressive behaviors. But for the most part, you're going to have to think about the learning aspects, which we'll talk about at some point, and the genetic aspects as well. So it's kind of a combination of the two, which is good. That's why we've been as successful as a species as we have. We've got sort of genetic tendencies and predispositions, but we also have some learning mechanisms on top of that.
No, because I was actually about to ask something like that myself, because I was going to ask.
You're not getting extra time off class. You already asked.
No, I was really asking could nurture outweigh nature in that? Sometimes, even if you are born with certain traits or whatever that would make you more susceptible to aggression, could your environment and stuff influence you to not be as aggressive?
Yeah, I think there are going to be limits on both sides, right? No matter what environment you grow up in, no matter how powerful that is to maybe make you not aggressive, you're still going to have the capacity to be aggressive, assuming you have sort of those normal genes, right? You're still going to have that sort of possibility. I think there's still going to be things that would occur that would make you aggressive, right? Even if that aggression is defensive aggression, right? So let's imagine you're raised in a very peaceful. This is something we don't think about, right? What if you're a pacifist, like a complete pacifist, right? Most people would not just stand there and let you beat them on the head with a stick, right? They're going to get into some defensive posture naturally, right? I wish I had something heavy to throw at you right now, because I could very quickly demonstrate to you a natural defensive behavior, right? I mean, what happens? You're walking down the street and something falls. You're jumping into a defensive posture, right? That's an aggressive behavior. That doesn't mean you're necessarily attacking. That doesn't mean you're necessarily, walking down the street looking for things to fall on you, right? That can be different, but yeah, you're still going to have those underlying mechanisms, which is great. Because if you didn't, and then you find yourself in an environment where you need some extra aggression, right? Because your environment changes, then you're really going to be at a loss. And I'll tell you something really cool about the human species. One of the things we're really great at is adapting to changing environments, right? And if you don't believe that, take a quick peek at where the human species started, right, on the savannas in Africa, and then compare the rest of the world to that, and it's different, right? And so everywhere the human species has migrated, something's been different, and they've had to adapt to that. We've not changed our bodies really, right? There have been minor fluctuations in how we might express genes, but we're still sucking in air the same way, right? We're still digesting food the same way, right? It's a lot of our behavioral plasticity, right? That's been important in that. So, but we still have some of those natural tendencies as well. Does that make sense? Does that give you some idea? All right. So one of the problems with this is evaluation is so important to success, but it's really not typically studied very well, right? Particularly from a genetic standpoint. And again, one of the problems with that is if you're going to study genetics, animal models are great for that, right? Human models are great for that. But it's a little difficult to put humans in an environment and measure how many times they fight another human, right? You can do that with mice and rats. You can get by with that. Fish. You can do it with fish a lot too. We'll talk about some of those later. All right, development of aggression. Talked about that a bit. The specific motor pattern is not necessarily going to be affected by the environment, but how often and how intensely you perform that behavior, right? So again, you're always going to flinch and cover your head, right? but what's the environment in which you live? Do you live in an environment where you've got like 4 older brothers and they're constantly beating you about the head, right? You're going to more intensely sort of defend. And that's that balance between nature and nurture, so to speak, right? So we did a great job covering that slide. Questions?
I missed most of the other side. Just kidding me, hold on. What was that again then? Development of aggression?
Yeah. So you're going to have that genetic predisposition for the pattern, for the specific manifestation of that behavior. But how often you pull out that pattern of behavior and how intensely you go through that pattern, that can be influenced by your environment. Okay? Does that make sense?
That makes sense.
Yeah. If you live in an environment that's, I'm going to try to.
Your brother hits you on the head with a bat every day.
Yeah. You're going to very intensely respond and be constantly ready to get into that defensive posture. Okay? Let's say you are the older brother. You're still going to get into the defensive posture if somebody goes to hit you in the head, right? Even though, huh?
Dad can't.
That, yeah, I guess, right? I mean, that's a good example. But you're still going to be ready for that, even though you're not necessarily the one who's typically receiving that attack. You're still going to have that pattern, which is good because there are still, as we've said, there's always somebody bigger. There's always somebody ahead of you somewhere, right? So you have to be ready for that. All right. Why would we want to look at what we call comparative genetics? So basically, you can identify a gene in a mouse, in a rat, and then you can look for the same gene or a similar gene in humans, right? Since we all kind of share some genetic, background, some similarity across species, you can do this, right? You might think that your life is completely different from that of a fish, but when you boil it down to those basic things of acquiring food and mates, it's the same story, right? And every species has solved that problem one way or the other, and often they've solved it in the same way, right? They solve that problem the same way genetically or behaviorally. Okay? It might be manifested a bit differently. If you're a fish, the way you show aggression might be different than if you're a crab or a dog or a tadpole, I don't know, whatever. But it's going to be, you're still trying to do the same things. You're still trying to survive until you're of reproductive age, try to reproduce as much as you can, and then die. Does that make sense?
Makes so much.
Anytime. Yeah. Next time, anybody on a sports team, you need a guy to come do a pep talk, I'm there for you. Constantly. Maybe they should start paying me to be a special coach for the Marshall sports team, so let's go in. All right, guys, I know you're going to go out there, do whatever you do, I guess. You'll die in the end. Have fun. Conference USA champs all the way, right? So anyway, we can identify these genes across species. We can also look for neural mechanisms across species, right? So if we know something about the genetics of a species, we can look at its brain structure, or brain might be a bit of a stretch if you're like, a lobster, but they have neurons, right? We'll talk about those. You can kind of look at that. Find the same thing in a lobster you find in a human and go like, oh, well, here we can, tweak this couple neurons, see what happens, and see what happens in humans. There is what we call like a gene-environment interaction. Some folks think about this as like, what is the gene environment, but that's kind of the wrong way to think about it. Genes and environment are constantly interacting. That's what genes do, right? They respond to environmental things, environmental influences and triggers, and then, create something more or create less, whatever. There are some basic approaches to comparative genetics. One thing that we try to do is find the location of those genes, right, on the chromosome. Where are they? If we find where they are in humans, they might be, or in mice, they might be somewhere similar to humans. We could look for, what we call homologous situations. Another thing we can do is mutate a gene and then see what behaviors we get, right? Again, this doesn't really work in people. This is why we use non-human animals, right? It's kind of the title slide. Because we can't go into a human and go, Caitlin, I'm going to mutate some genes of yours. I'm going to see if that makes you more aggressive. That sounds like fun, right? Nobody's going to let me do that.
I might.
You might. Yeah, but I feel like I'm not going to get the money to do that from like the government.
Germany did.
Germany did?
When they gave out drugs like nobody's business. They did gene research. They did it legally. They did all of that.
Yeah,
They
they're-
did do it.
They did. There are a bunch of international conventions, national regulations, and just sort of basic, human ethics that prevent you from doing a lot of that now. If you've taken a class from Dr. LeGros, he's probably talked to you about some of that. I don't know if you guys, I know we've done, when you do like research methods and stuff, right? So he talks about some of that stuff, which is great, that you know not to do that. But again, we have to figure out some way to do this, right? So the way we've bypassed some of that is we use animal studies. And then there are things called gene chips. Basically, these are not like potato chips, just to let you know, you don't eat these. But you can measure gene expression across the development of an individual, right? So at different times in your life, different genes are active or not active, okay? One great example of that is, how many of you have been through puberty? I'm going to assume all of you have been. That's a pretty standard assumption, right? Once you've reached that, second, third, or plus decade of your life, that happens, right? So you get through the first few years, and then certain genes start kicking on, right? And they start making more of certain hormones. Different things happen. You start sprouting stuff in different places, depending on what genes you have and sort of the combination of those. But again, that's also a great example of how the environment can interact with that gene, right? So there are examples of like delaying puberty, particularly in females, if they're not exposed to like male pheromones from urine in males. So yeah, if you ever want, it's too late for most of you, I assume, but if you ever want to delay like the onset of puberty for, again, it typically works in females, males it doesn't seem to work. Just don't let them like smell urine from guys, and then they'll be fine. Are you going to ask about that? Because I can tell you.
No, I'm not.
Okay.
Just with the environment.
Okay.
In human research, does it take account into the perception of the environment as the environment affecting the gene? So like an optimist versus a pessimist when a given.
That's interesting. I'm not aware of any literature that does that, but that's actually an interesting approach. You think optimists are more aggressive or
Like, would it have more of an effect on the aggressive gene?
Yeah. I'm trying to think about a mechanism. I hesitate to say yes, I hesitate to say no. Because if I say yes, it sounds like you can just like think your way into making your genes do things,
Right.
which I don't really want to leave you with that impression. Because I don't want you to like sit there and go like, I'm going to turn on some genes, hold on. And just try to do that. But at the same time, I don't want to send you out there thinking like you don't have any ability to influence your behavior by your thoughts, right? And what that could lead to. So, well, it sounds like two people have their paper topics already selected. So there you go. Great job. Yeah, that's interesting. Perceived environment. I think hopefully the actual environment would be more important than the perceived environment. The reason I say that is it's the actual environment you have to respond to, not your perceived environment, right? For the most part, at least, looking at our species historically or other species, right? Just because the crab thinks it's a better environment doesn't mean that it can respond in the way that it's better and be successful. So I would say compared to, looking back through any species, compared to the members of that species who responded to the perceived environment, your ancestors were more likely to respond to the actual environment. Otherwise, they would have died and you wouldn't exist. Okay? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And then I wouldn't get 5 cents from all your tuition dollars to pay my salary. I always wonder how much per student, what you paid for tuition, how much of that I get. I think it's 5 cents per student over the course of your 4 to 7 years here, depending on how long it takes you to graduate. All right, questions about that? That was pretty good. Hey, who wants to learn about flies? So what we're going to do now is briefly sort of go through some different species, talk just a little bit about some research that's been done with those that particular animal. Not really anything too deep, right? Just to kind of give you an idea about what's going on. Here are fruit flies, right? There's the male. You can tell it's the male because they put the word male above it. That's always the best way to tell. And then here's the female. There's some differences in body size as well. Now, typically we think about males being larger than females. That works really great for mammals. In case you don't know, even though it looks like there's hair, fruit flies are not mammals, right? They're insects, so that's kind of fun. There are sex differences in aggression. That's very true in mammals, right? We want to think about mammals largely because we share a very similar sort of hormonal environment, you know, with rabbits and dogs and whatever other furry creature you can think of. Okay. Why fruit flies are fun to use is you can make easy comparisons between these genetic variants. We know they have a relatively small, they only have 4 chromosomes, right? So they have relatively small DNA material, and there's not a whole lot there to get confused in. They reproduce rapidly. Okay. If you want to study human genetics, like you have to wait a long time, right? You're like wondering, well, I'm going to make this little tweak and so and we're going to see what happens. Well, you got to wait till they have kids, and you got to wait till their kids have kids, and their kids have kids, right? And so, you know, you might be hundreds or thousands or millions of years down the line before you see if that had any effect on behavior. Fruit flies, they reproduce in minutes, right? And in the short span of, you know, a month or so, you can have many generations of fruit flies, and so you can really look at the effects of those genetic mutations, right, those variants. So they're kind of nice, kind of a shortened time span. Who loves honeybees? Yeah, honeybees are cool, right? You guys need to like do things to keep honeybees because we're about to lose them all. So that's something. How many of you got a honeybee tattoo last year? Anybody get one of those? Yeah, see? Aspen looked at me like, what is he talking about? Like, why is he asking? But there was a fundraiser, right? And you could get a bee tattoo if you contributed to that. So why are honeybees interesting? Well, they're interesting because they actually live in these sort of dense social environments like humans. There are only a small number of species that have this sort of structure, this eusocial structure, where there are like different roles within that colony, right? And so bees are that way, ants are that way as well, right? You've got like reproducing ants, you've got fighting ants, you've got digging ants, right? All in that same colony and in the same species. What's kind of interesting about honeybees and some other species is they have this weird sort of genetic arrangement. And at some point we'll talk about like genetic relatedness. But for right now, think about this. Most of the time you don't want to reduce the reproductive capacity of your genetic relatives, right? Because what do your genetic relatives have that you have? Well, you got some similar DNA, right? Any of you have a biological sibling? Both share the same parents? Yeah, they've got 50% of the same DNA as you, right? And so, as ridiculous as I might think my sister is, like 50% of her is probably the same as me, right? And so I probably shouldn't try to interfere, right, in any way with that reproductive capacity, right? So you guys think about that. You know, so be nicer to your siblings, or not. I don't know, it's up to you. These honeybees and ants, they kind of have a similar, they have a little different situation, which is really weird. All of the females, I mean, it's really weird the way they share DNA. So they're actually, their siblings are more related than your sibling. Like, because of the way they reproduce, instead of being like 50% similar DNA, they're like 75% similar DNA, right? So they have like, they're much more likely to be similar. which is really interesting because they still do fight each other and they try to push people away. We can study honeybees in terms of gene expression over the development, right, of developmental course, because there are different sort of types of honeybees. It's what we call guards and stingers, right? So these are, just to let you know, these are honeybees that guard and they sting. I know, right? It's very creative names there. And at a certain point, they actually turn on genes that control stinging behavior, right? Because that's what they want to do. Then there are nurses and foragers. Guess what they do? Well, they take care of the young and they forage for food. And they actually have some genes called period and foraging that get turned on when they kind of reach a certain age and they click over to be foragers, which is really interesting. What's interesting about this, there's this kin selection theory, which basically says you're going to try to help out close relatives if you can. What's good about this, though, is even though aggression should be reduced between relatives, right? So the more genetically similar you are, the more likely you're going to reduce aggression. I know a lot of you are going to say, well, what about parents and kids fighting? And there's some interesting things that ride on top of that we'll talk about. But in this particular case, here's the queen. You know it's the queen because she has a number on her. You know it's the queen because it's bigger, right? She's bigger. What is the resource value of being the queen? Like, what's the resource value is really high because only one queen reproduces, right? And so when multiple queens are born at any given time, they're going to have to try to fight each other because that resource value exceeds how happy you are that you've got a sister, right? So that's kind of interesting. Oh, who loves sticklebacks? How many of you know those are fish? Okay. Hey, sticklebacks are fish. Now how many of you know sticklebacks are fish? Great. About 3 of you. We'll get there. Why would we study sticklebacks? Well, you and I might not, but if you were from, like the Netherlands or something, and you got really interested in animal behavior, you might do that. And there was this guy, Nico Tinbergen, a long time ago. He was like, hey, man, sticklebacks are cool. And he got a Nobel Prize for that, along with a couple other folks. They're very aggressive, males and females, during their entire in their entire development, right, which is really interesting. They show juvenile aggression. They show territorial aggression, right? They'll build these nests and defend these nests, which is kind of interesting. One of the things, because we've studied the development of individual sticklebacks over time, we know that if they were really aggressive as a juvenile, they tend to be really aggressive as an adult, right? So we can look at this longitudinally, which is kind of cool, right? It's kind of hard to do that in humans, right? Because you got to go like, well, let's see. Some people go make some humans. Let's put them in an environment, watch them for a long time, and in 30 or 40 years, we'll figure out if they were aggressive adults. Well, that seems to take a long time, right? Seems like you can't really control that very well. Now, how could you do this in humans if you wanted to study longitudinal aggression? You could look at individuals who, their school records, right? Maybe they had some problems when they were kids. Then maybe as adults, then you can look at court records, right? But there are a lot of problems with that. Getting the sort of police records for folks under the age of 18 could be a trick, right? Because there is some, right? I mean, those are. You can get the police records for sticklebacks, though, right? Okay, you can look those police records all day long. It's public knowledge. You grab 2 fish, you write it down. Everybody has it. Okay, it's not a big deal. You don't have to worry about privacy concerns. What's also interesting here is that there's a correlation between dominance and territorial aggression in males. So males that are trying to defeat other fish and say like, hey, I'm the top fish, also seem to show the most territorial aggression, which means they try to keep and maintain and take over territory. And we'll talk about different types of aggression later. But that makes sense too, right? If there's some genetic mechanism that's driving aggression, it's probably going to have an effect on all forms of aggression, right? Now, there might be specific forms of aggression that have different genetic underpinnings, right? But they're also probably going to share some common genes as well. Hey, who loves chickens? Chickens are actually really aggressive too, right? Yeah, I know, right? I mean, anybody know Werner Herzog? He's a filmmaker. No, nobody knows. You should check him out. Yeah, he has this whole, there's like this whole rant he has on how dumb chickens are on, it was just hilarious. And I like watching it once in a while. He's like, talks about staring into the eyes of a chicken and there's nothing there, it's like empty. Yeah, you guys should check that out. So, you know, you can study aggressive behavior in chickens, right? It is heritable in males and females, right? So typically we think about aggression, we think about males unless it's maternal aggression, but there's aggression in females as well. We will find that one of the sort of hormonal drives of aggression is testosterone, right? So individuals with more testosterone tend to be more aggressive. How can you identify someone with more testosterone than someone else? Check for people with beards, right? If you're with beards, you're already sort of in that like upper half of folks for aggression and testosterone, right? So there you go. Watch out for that.
Are we
guy.
talking full beards? Are we talking about patchy ones too?
I'm talking about facial hair in general. You tend to be a male, you know, and you're going to have a higher testosterone level. That'd be interesting though. You could look at like, you know, facial hair density. I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, because there's some people that can grow down.
Yeah, I don't know that length matters,
Some that can't
but I
go
think
anywhere.
density might be more important because you could let hair grow forever, right? You just don't cut. But now, hey, 3 of you, you got papers.
You talked about crabs, I was gonna do it on there.
All right, so there you go. Oh, and there's some genes that control pecking behavior. So if you're a chicken, how do you express aggression? You go peck another chicken. I mean, you don't have a lot of options as a chicken. You're sort of limited in what you can do. But you can definitely go like, try to peck the eyes out of another chicken, right? You got that option. And there are some genes that actually control pecking behavior in chickens. Chickens are a little, I mean, brighter than what you think they are. I lost a tic-tac-toe match once to a chicken. That's a true story. When I was a kid, they had, I don't know, we were on vacation somewhere. They had this like chicken in a box. You put in a quarter, and you could play tic-tac-toe against the chicken. If you won, you got one of those little like prizes that comes out of those like quarter machines, or you know what I'm talking about. In my defense, I was like 8, and I lost to this chicken at tic-tac-toe. I think it cheated, but you know that's a separate story. Chickens also are really interesting. I don't know if you guys know how chickens work. You get one rooster and you get a bunch of hens, right? That's how chickens work. That's how you get more chickens, right? Or that's how you get omelets, whichever way you want to go. You don't have to have more chickens, you just get eggs that way. Well, I guess you can get eggs without a rooster, but you know, you got to give the rooster something to do. So roosters definitely want to like mate with hens, right? That's kind of what they do. So chickens have interesting noises they make, you know, like clucks and stuff. But they have a special set of noises they make if there's like a hawk coming in, right? Like a bird of prey. And so what some really intelligent roosters that are clever will do is they'll kind of run over into another rooster's territory and start going like, hey, there's a hawk, go hide, there's a hawk. And what will the rooster do? Well, he'll try to, you know, like the one that's surprised, like, oh man, there's a hawk. We'll try to round up as many hens as he can, but he can't round up all of his hens, right? So there are going to be like a few hens hanging around, and then that rooster that had the false alarm is going to go like, hey, that is really not a hawk. I just wanted to get, you know, rooster number 1 out of the way so we could have some time alone. And then they'll it's chickens are wily. You got to watch them. I prefer my chickens in nugget form. They're safer that way. Removes the beaks. What about mammals? Okay, we're going to leave this as a, we're going to kind of not talk a whole lot about mammals because we're going to spend the rest of the semester sort of focusing on mammals. We'll spend a lot of time probably next week talking about crustaceans, right? So you'll know more about lobsters and crabs than you ever want to. But there's been a ton of research on mammals as well. Mice and rats, they're pretty standard laboratory animals. You guys have probably thought about that in some way, right? We can measure how aggressive mice are. What they'll often do is one of the tests that they will do is called a resident intruder test. So you have a mouse, and mice tend to be a little better than rats. Mice are a little more aggressive. You'll have a mouse, it's in its cage, and then what you do is you move in somebody else, right? And what's going to happen? That first mouse is going to go like, hey, this is my house. What are you doing here? and they're going to try to like fight the other mouse out. So you can measure how aggressive a particular mouse is, a strain of mice. You can give them drugs or hormones, or alter their DNA and see if that affects their aggressive behavior. And so that's an approach. There are these guys called voles. Voles are kind of cool. We'll talk about those as we need to. They actually have this vasopressin receptor. Some voles do. They can use that to trigger. Mason, what was that?
I'm thinking the same thing. They're diggers, correct?
Oh yeah, they live in vole holes. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, they live down in holes. Sorry, I didn't know. I missed the. That was a little. Next time, use a shovel. That'll reduce any ambiguity there. Well, there's a whole story about promiscuous voles as well, and that's a whole different story. But you can actually activate these receptors, and it'll sort of change their aggressive behavior. Dogs, really interesting to study aggression in dogs, right? Particularly submissive behaviors in dogs, right? They have a very stereotypical sort of submissive behavior. How many of you have a dog? You go home, what's that dog do? Hopefully it rolls over, right? That's the reason you're in charge. And then we have primates, right? That's not just monkeys, that's apes and humans. Humans are apes. A lot of people like to put us in a different group, but primates are a great model to study as well. They're a little more difficult to start manipulating their DNA. Again, they live a little longer. People tend to think differently about primates than they do some other animals, right? So they kind of give them a few more protections. But there are a number of studies about primates as well that we'll talk about as we go through the semester. So that'll be thrilling and exciting as well. Okay. Any questions? That's kind of where I'd like to end for the day. All of this will be on Blackboard. So if you